So April 30th just passed, and that marked the 50th anniversary of Vietnam's reunification, a really major historical moment.
Absolutely significant. And what's quite striking when you dig into it is the name they chose, Reunification Day.
Yeah, exactly. Reunification Day, not, say, Victory Day or maybe Anti-Imperialism Day, which you might almost expect given the history, right?
Right. Considering the decades fighting first the French, then the Americans, it definitely makes you ask why that particular emphasis. What was the thinking behind reunification?
Okay, let's try to unpack that. Our source for this deep dive, mainly an article from the Eurasian Times, suggests it wasn't just about, kicking out foreign powers. It seems the Vietnamese leadership had this incredible foresight. They graphed that real, lasting sovereignty depended entirely on achieving complete national unity.
That's the core argument, yes. The Eurasian Times piece argues that without that full reunification, Vietnam was probably looking at a future of, constant instability.
But what sort of instability?
Oh, the classic problems. Volatile borders, needing a massive military budget for an endless arms race, probably foreign bases on their soil again.
And the constant threat of war hanging over them.
Exactly. It really highlights how fundamental complete control over your own territory is for, genuine independence.
It makes you think about sovereignty differently. It's not just a political idea, it's tied to the actual map, the physical borders.
Right. And the Eurasian Times suggests this wasn't just a lucky guess or wishful thinking. Vietnam had historical examples to look at, these cautionary tales of what happens when nations get fractured by outside powers.
Cautionary tales, I like that. So they learned from others' mistakes, basically.
It seems so.
Right.
And it connects to how imperialism often worked. It wasn't always just about grabbing land or resources. Sometimes it was about deliberately drawing lines on maps, creating divisions.
You mean like artificially splitting up societies?
Yeah, even way back. Think about the early Portuguese settlements in places like Goa or Bombay, or the Dutch in Galley. They set up coastal bases that cut off existing connections within those societies. It laid the groundwork for fragmentation later on.
Okay, interesting. But things really ramped up later, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. The article points to the scramble for Africa in the late 1800s as a kind of peak colonialism in this sense.
The Berlin Conference, right, 1884, 1885. Bismarck.
That's the one. They essentially took a map of Africa and drew lines all over it, completely ignoring the ethnic groups, the cultures, the existing political structures on the ground. It was just about carving it up for European benefit.
A total frenzy of treaty signing and border drawing based on European convenience.
Precisely. And you can even trace lines from that, as historians do, to the tensions that eventually exploded into World War I. Colonial rivalries were a big factor.
And then, ironically, it was the world wars that weakened those same colonial powers enough for decolonization to really take off.
Yes, but the damage, those arbitrary borders, was often already done. And the Eurasian Times also mentions the divide and rule tactic.
Ah, yes. Deliberately playing groups off against each other to maintain control.
Exactly. Stirring up existing tensions or even creating new ones within the colonies. It made ruling easier for the imperial power, but left behind these deep scars and fault lines.
And the long-term consequences. Devastating in many cases.
Absolutely. Look at the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. The British presented it as protecting Muslim interests, but the way the border was drawn so hastily...
The Radcliffe Line.
Yes, it led to unimaginable violence, mass displacement, and sowed the seeds for conflict that's lasted decades. 4 wars.
1948, 65, 71, 99.
Right. And border clashes are still a constant threat. It's a legacy of that imposed division.
And you see echoes of that, tragically, in the creation of Israel and Palestine around the same time, 1948.
Very similar pattern. Again, Britain involved, claiming to protect Jewish interests this time, leading to the creation of Israel, another imposed border.
And a conflict that seems, never-ending. Look at Gaza right now. It just underscores how deep and persistent these problems caused by imposed divisions can be.
And it wasn't just direct colonial partitions. The Cold War created its own set of divisions, didn't it? Based on ideology.
Germany being the prime example, I suppose.
Definitely. A major European power just split down the middle, East versus West, Soviet influence versus U.S., British, French.
And Berlin itself divided. The wall, such a stark symbol.
And for decades, Germany couldn't really fulfill its potential, could it? So much energy was focused inwards on the division itself.
Until 1989. Reunification really allowed Germany to become the economic powerhouse it is today. It shows what happens when that division is removed.
A powerful example. And then there's Korea.
Also divided after World War II, after Japanese occupation ended.
Right. North backed by the Soviets, becoming communist, South backed by the U.S., pro-Western, and that led straight into the Korean War in the 50s.
The war that never officially ended. Just an armistice.
Exactly. So technically, they're still at war. And look at the consequences. North Korea developing missiles, nuclear weapons, the constant U.S. military presence in the South.
A permanent arms race, basically, and the constant fear it could all flare up again.
It's another stark example of potential unrealized because of division.
Okay, so bringing it back to Vietnam. When you see it against that backdrop, India, Pakistan, Israel-Palestine, Germany, Korea, their determination makes more sense.
It really does. They went through French rule, then Japanese occupation during World War II.
Then Ho Chi Minh declaring independence in the North in 1945, but the French came back, supported by the U.S. eventually.
Right, leading to the First Indochina War, and then the Geneva Accords in 1954, which crucially divided the country.
At the 17th parallel, that could have been another Korea situation, couldn't it? A permanent division.
It absolutely could have been. But Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese leadership refused to accept it as permanent. They saw it as temporary and were determined to reunify.
Which led to the second phase, the war involving the Americans directly from the early 60s, officially from 65.
Yes. And despite the unbelievable military power the U.S. brought to bear, the bombing campaigns, the sheer scale of the fighting, the North Vietnamese just kept fighting. Their resilience was incredible.
Facing staggering losses, too.
Unimaginable losses. But the goal, reunification, remained absolute.
Until April 30th, 1975, the fall of Saigon. That image of the tank crashing through the palace gates.
It wasn't just the end of the war. It was the symbol of that goal finally being achieved. Complete reunification.
And we have to acknowledge the cost. The Eurasian Times notes the figures. It's staggering.
Yeah.
Maybe 30 billion pounds of munitions dropped by the U.S.
And an unbelievable amount. And the human cost.
Yeah.
Estimates of around 3.8 million Vietnamese dead, over 11 million displaced.
Plus the long-term effects, like from Agent Orange, affecting potentially millions more. The pain was immense.
Yeah, absolutely immense. And you have to imagine, during the darkest days of the war, there must have been doubts. Was this path, this immense sacrifice, worth it?
But looking back now, 50 years on, and seeing the history of those other partition nations we talked about.
Exactly. Seeing the ongoing conflicts, the instability in places like Korea or the Middle East, the tensions between India and Pakistan, it does seem to validate Vietnam's decision, doesn't it?
It suggests their leaders understood something profound about the long-term dangers of imposed division.
That true peace, true stability, true sovereignty required being whole. So Vietnam today is united, fully sovereign, and, importantly, at peace within its borders. A stark contrast.
So Reunification Day wasn't about downplaying the fight against imperialism at all.
No, quite the opposite, I'd argue. It was a statement about what the ultimate goal of that fight was. Not just independence, but united independence. Recognizing that division itself was a tool of imperial control with lasting, dangerous consequences.
It's a really powerful perspective. And for you listening, especially if you were preparing for the UPSC exams, this whole discussion around Vietnam offers, I think, really valuable insights.
Definitely. Understanding this history, the legacy of imperialism, the strategic importance of national unity, the consequences of partition, it's all incredibly relevant for analyzing contemporary geopolitics.
It gives you that deeper context for understanding border disputes, national identity issues, and the quest for sovereignty that play out all over the world today. It's that holistic view that's so important.
Which brings us to maybe a final thought for you to chew on. Thinking about these examples, Vietnam, Korea, India, Pakistan, Palestine, Israel, what might be some of the less obvious, perhaps hidden, long-term consequences of unresolved border disputes or territorial issues that exist today? What ripples might they be sending out that we don't always see?
That's a great question to ponder, something to really think about as you follow current events. If you found this deep dive helpful for your understanding or your UPSC prep, please do give us a like, subscribe for more, and feel free to drop any further questions in the comments.
And again, our discussion today drew heavily on the analysis presented in the Eurasian Times article on this topic.